Personally, I don't use a ton of higher order functions that return a function, but knowing how to do it and when to do it can really add to your coding arsenal. In our store, we have many mutations that do the same thing. I am referring to the append x to z mutations. Each one of these mutations accepts a parent ID and a child ID. Here, the parent ID is the thread ID and the child ID is the post ID. Then, it finds the parent resource in the state, in this case, the thread. It checks if it has a property to append the child ID to, and then creates it if it doesn't. Lastly, it pushes the child ID to the property of the parent. The difference between all these mutations is the type of the parent and the property name to append the children to. So, we can create a higher order function that will create these mutations for us. I will create a function right before creating the vuex store. I will name it makeAppendChild to parent mutation. This name is quite long, but it's fine since it is descriptive and will only be used internally to create mutations. To get started, I will copy the code from one of our mutations. Right now, this function returns the append post to thread mutation. So if we call it where we define the mutations, we shouldn't notice any changes, right? Let's create a post to find out. Everything works fine. How I'd like this to work is I'd like to give the makeAppendChild to parent mutation function the parent and the child, like threads and posts, and get a mutation that appends a post to a thread. Back in our function, I'll add these arguments. Remember that this function returns a function that is the mutation. What we want this mutation to do is to find a resource first, like a thread, and then append the child ID to a specified property. So that we can start thinking of this function as dynamic, I will rename the thread variable to resource. When we called this function, we passed the threads value as the parent and the posts as the child. So, we can rename the thread ID to the parent ID and the post ID to the child ID. With the code we have right now, the resource will always be a thread. So, we can replace that with the parent argument. Because we cannot use a variable after the period, we can write it like this. In case you didn't know, typing user.name is the same as typing user bracket name bracket. Let's do the same for the child and replace resource.posts with resource child. So now what we have is a function that returns a function. The function returned accepts the state as the first argument, as our mutation did. And the second argument is an object with a parent ID and a child ID property. And since we bind this function to the append post to thread mutation, now the mutation needs the parent ID and the child ID instead of the thread ID and the post ID it used to accept. So let's update the code where we commit this mutation. Let's give it a shot in the browser by creating a post. And it works fine. So now we can use our awesome makeAppendChildToParent mutation function to generate the rest of our mutations. I love how short they became. Now we just have to update the places where we commit append thread to forum and append thread to user mutations with the parent ID and the child ID properties like we did for append post to thread. Alright, we're ready to check it out. I will create a thread. I will make a post. Cool, everything is working good. If you are wondering about where we should put the makeAppend function, we could put it in the helper file or create something new, but since we're only using it in the store, it's fine to leave it in the store file. I would like to move it to the bottom though. I want to do this because it's more of an implementation detail. In other words, moving through our store file from top to bottom, I really want to see state, getters, actions, and mutations of our store first. And then any supporting code like this function is last priority, and you really only want to look at it if you want to know how the append child to parent mutation works in detail. In order to do this, we will have to make one slight change to the function definition. Instead of creating a variable and assigning it a function, we will use the more traditional function declaration syntax. This is necessary because the function is defined after it is called in the mutation above. Variables declared with let and const must be declared before they are used, and this is a good thing that helps to keep your code more error-free. Functions defined in this traditional syntax, however, don't have to be. This is because of a JavaScript concept called hoisting. The function behaves as if it were hoisted to the top of the file and defined before it was called. This exact situation of defining functions that act more like implementation details at the bottom of a file is really the only good thing I know of about hoisting, but it definitely helps with code organization and readability.